everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Wonka take the #1 spot the first weekend in January. January, the month where most films go to die, with very few exceptions. It's looking like Night Swim might be performing well enough to be able to make its money back, but that still remains to be seen. It was a very small budgeted film, but it's also a film that was not able to get the #1 spot as a horror film, as the only real new release this past weekend. And so a film that's been out for a lot longer than that, several weeks now at this point, Wonka, taking that #1 spot is actually a very good sign for Wonka, and a middling sign at the really at the best case scenario for that, a middling sign for Night Swim. So we got some numbers to break down there. We also, of course, got to talk about Aquaman 2 because, again, the numbers continued to be spun by mainstream media outlets. As you can see, Tony saying here, Aquaman 2, it's hitting $100 million domestic. That's amazing. When in reality, that's just not at all. I think that ultimately you have a lot of people looking at the worldwide box office for that film and just not grasping the fact that they do not get as big of a return on their investments when they have massive numbers in the overseas markets, especially in China, where the return on investment is a lot smaller for American studios in those regions of the world, right? Especially when we deal with the Communist Party of China trying to take as much money as they possibly can. And so Aquaman 2 is in still a lot of financial trouble, and this really is not all that much of a surprise for the DCEU, and also the fact the film is just not good. It's just nonstop propaganda about environmentalism thrown into a film that features Aquaman, kind of, and that's ultimately all that it really is. And I know that there's some people out there that do enjoy it, but I think that is probably the reason why a lot of people have just checked out of it altogether. Not to mention the fact that the DCEU has been basically dead for quite a long time, ever since it was announced that it would be getting a fresh restart with James Gunn, and a lot of things and a lot of decisions that have been made and a lot of things that have been said really haven't been helping it all that much either. All of this, of course, while it talks about the fact that we are now down 18% in the first week of 2024 compared to that of 2023, all the while you also at the same time have Nancy, good old Nance, and this was a few days ago, talking about how the global box office had reached $33.9 billion in 2023, which was a 31% increase. But once again, you are failing to recognize the fact that when you talk about how much money was spent on movies in comparison to how much was made, it was still a really, really bad year. So yes, overall numbers might be going up, but actual profits have essentially all but disappeared, with very few films actually being able to essentially justify their own existence by making any money back. And so those are the things we'll talk about today. Before going any further, please make sure you smash that like button, line up that fire button on Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. Hit that bell notification. That way you know every time your video or live stream goes live on the channel. Apologies for not having a box office preview for the upcoming weekend. I unfortunately just had a lot of crazy stuff happening here at home, and I know that y'all all understand that when you've got kids, especially younger kids, that sometimes those things obviously will take some precedence, and time in general kind of goes away from you. But talking again about Tony's nonsense here, again, Tony, good old Tony at Deadline, talking about how everything is down 18% from last year, and this is basically starting a year that many are projecting to be one of the worst years box office-wise in a long time. Now, that's not saying a whole lot because we obviously had the record lows during the COVID years when nothing essentially was being shown, but the fact that you saw them, quote, have the highest box office that they've had ever since the pandemic started and almost got somewhat to recovery levels, to the 2019 levels, maybe, or maybe ballpark. Even then, it's like, okay, did they even really get that close? Again, you have to look at these numbers within the context of how much they actually spent and how much these films actually cost to make, rather than just the actual raw numbers that are being thrown in there. And so I think that it's just interesting that all the while 2023 might have been up from the previous year and might have been showing a forward trajectory. News like this is definitely not showing that trajectory is going to continue into this year, as this first week is seeing just that. Especially when you compare the fact that around the same time this year, last year, we had the film Megan come out, which had a viral social media presence and was able to get a lot of people to go out and see that. That was one of those surprise early January hits that most of the time do not happen. In this case, now we have a $15 million film called Night Swim, which just ultimately does not really look all that interesting. Someone who's not really a horror fan, I can say that it doesn't really try to bring at least non-horror fan audiences in. And based on the numbers that we're seeing, it's looking like the audiences that this film is going for are not really showing up in droves to see it either. So again, when you have that comparison, it also helps to explain why. The fact that Wonka, which came out, again, almost a month ago at this point, is performing as well as it is in the number one spot, right, is doing the number one spot at this point, I think also screams to the weakness of the Christmas Day releases, none of which are in that number one or number two spots, and also just how poorly those films have been doing altogether. Going into the numbers over at thenumbers.com, of course, talking here about the domestic. So Wonka dropped another 36%. This film now has been out for 4 weeks, so this fourth weekend, it dropped from 234 screens and only dropped 36%. So the holds for Wonka have actually been pretty good. This is something that I've been mentioning now for several weeks, that this was the movie that seemed to be the holiday choice, right? This was the movie that seemed to be the choice that families were going to see and going to support. And seeing that the film is pretty much inoffensive, seeing that it's a movie that, for me, I thought it was decent. My critical score was decent for the film. I thought it was fine. It's nothing that's going to obviously hold a candle anywhere close to holding a candle, I should say, to the original Willy Wonka film, but it's also not going to be something where you see a lot of times in modern day Hollywood, films that just tear down the source material or tear down the characters or try to do something that basically, pushes it in a certain direction. You didn't really see that with this movie, right? This movie was mostly inoffensive, and ultimately that's what a lot of families want to ultimately go and see. Doesn't mean the film is good, but the fact that the film is now currently where it is financially, it's in a pretty decent spot. It's actually in the process of making its money back and making some profit, which for Warner Brothers is a very, very rare feat. And this film is continuing and looks to continue to add on more and more money because, as I said, January is not typically a film or typically not a month where a lot of films have a lot of very high competition for high box office numbers. And so because of that, I ultimately do think that we're going to see Wonka probably stay in that top 3 for quite a bit. Night Swim was the new film from Universal, also, again, Universal/Blumhouse here. $12 million is its opening domestic. This is a film that's mostly going to be a domestic number maker. It's not going to be much of an international presence. Making $12 million means its per theater ratio is around 3,600. So even Wonka coming in at a higher per theater ratio there with more screens, again, speaks a lot more to just the power of Wonka going into really what would have been the last weekend of people being off, right? For me, I was able, we went back to school basically the last couple days of last week. Some private schools might have done that. Others might not be starting again until this Monday. So I do think that you probably will see some sharper drop-offs for some of these films, including films like Aquaman, for instance, next weekend, because this next coming week will be really the first full week where people have been back at work, back at school, and all those things. But Night Swim, as I said, it seems to be driving out at least the people who are interested in concepts like that, but not to any degree that we've seen from other films like it in the past, especially from Blumhouse. So it's looking like this film might be able to make its budget back, but that's really not saying all that much because the film did not cost a whole lot to make in the first place. Film that did cost way too much to make was Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, made $10.6 million, and so it's still in the top 3, but it dropped another 42%, dropped from 234 screens, so looks like they're staying pretty consistent with those numbers there. Again, that also coming from Warner Brothers, and is now kind of creeped a little bit over that $100 million hump, which I said was going to be probably difficult for this film to do. It's looking like now, based on the film and how it's pacing, you're looking at a tops of probably somewhere around 120, 125 in a best case scenario. I do think that you're going to see this film see some pretty massive drop-offs as more and more people are no longer able to actually see it, and as newer films start to get released, not that they're going to be, huge moneymakers themselves, but anytime there's any new films out, whether it's films like Night Swim, or other films set to come out, I do think that they're going to continue to take away those eyes from films like Aquaman. And 3 weeks out from its initial release, the fact that it took 3 weeks for the film to get to $100 million domestic, again, compared to films like The Marvels and other things like that, okay, that's good. But when you, again, compare the fact that that its budget is as high as it is, right, very much in that Marvel's territory, you also have the fact that a huge portion of the money that it has made coming from overseas. Migration also hanging around there, 40% hold, $77 million is what that film has made after 3 weeks of release, so Aquaman's actually done better. But Migration is one of those kinds of movies where, again, because it's a very generic animated Universal, Illumination movie, you could potentially actually see that edge out Aquaman in the long run. Again, I think Aquaman obviously was taking advantage of having those high school, college students still off, who are probably the predominant audience to go to see a movie like that. And I think that Migration, because typically you have that family audience that can show up, Wonka, I think, is a great example of that, for instance. I think you could see then Migration and Wonka kind of both follow a very similar trajectory in a lot of ways. I think that you're seeing that kind of in the holds percentage-wise at this point in time. So we'll have to, of course, wait and see in the long run whether it's able to actually do that, as Aquaman does have a decent advantage on that movie currently. Anyone But You, the romantic film from Sony, 9.5 million, one of those rare circumstances where it actually increased, right? It actually went up 9%. And I think I mentioned this last time that this is a movie that seems to be appealing to a lot of couples, right? This seems to be that film that a lot of couples are going to see. It's not really the kind of movie I would be interested in seeing. It just kind of looks like a very derivative movie, and the poster to me just is like, okay, you're trying to sell this movie on just pure sex appeal. I guess that appeals to some, but for others it's like, okay, I feel like that's just kind of a very cheap marketing tactic. But hey, you know what? Numbers are what they are, so it's definitely working to some degree. No change in theaters now in its third weekend of release, so hey, kudos to them for having that increase there. Though again, as I've mentioned previously, because of the audiences starting to go back into the school/work, regular everyday life starting this coming Monday, I would not be surprised to see a movie like that see a bigger drop off next weekend. Boys in the Boat from MGM dropped 28%. Right, this is a film that is getting some awards contention, or at least some attention from that. It does seem somewhat interesting. I believe that this is a movie that has been directed by George Clooney, if I'm not mistaken. So again, from MGM means it's coming from Amazon, so who knows exactly where this film will fall as far as its profitability is concerned. But hey, when you add on a number of theaters, this time 130, when you have a drop-off of 28% in your second week of release, that is still very good to see. Color Purple, not very much seeing, basically not seeing the kind of good things, right? In its opening weekend, it opened to fourth. It opened in fourth place. This was a Christmas Day release, and right now it's already dropping 59% in its second full weekend, and that means ultimately this movie is not making any money. This is actually going to be yet another $100 million flop for Warner Brothers, and I think I've talked about this already. This is following a very interestingly similar trajectory as the West Side Story film followed. It was a film that cost way much more than it probably should have ever cost. It was a remake to a movie that no one was really clamoring for a remake of, and I know that this obviously was a slightly quote reimagining of the original Color Purple, but even then, no one was really clamoring or asking for it. The audience is not showing up for it, so this is going to be yet another one of those films coming out of Warner Brothers where maybe they should start to rethink things. I really hope they have no other remakes of classic musicals or classic plays or anything like that in the pipe coming up, because at this point, it's not looking like they are getting anywhere with that audience, and I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves there. Iron Claw, once again, hanging out in that number 8 spot. It was in the number 7 spot last weekend, dropped only 3%, and the fact that it dropped 3%, but also dropped 300 screens, that's actually quite impressive for a film like it. This is one of those smaller A24 releases, so I hope more and more people go to see it. It's a film I think that absolutely deserves to make its money back and also to make some profit, as I think it's ultimately one of the best films to come out in 2023. Ferrari is not seeing a similar number there, right? A 36% hold in general is not bad, but when you also have to take into the context of what it made in its opening weekend, this is just not great, right? Ferrari is also, from Neon in this case, looking to be a $100 million flop as well, as we'll point out in a second when we go into the charts. Poor Things from Searchlight, so this is a Fox production, $2 million there, 12% decrease. This is a movie that to me just looks very depraved and just ridiculous, and I hope the film doesn't make any money back, because I don't like films like that to make money, because that sends the wrong message to Hollywood of, if you just keep on making these depraved stories about a woman who is, again, essentially it's a modern day retelling of Frankenstein. However, the issue is that you have a woman with the brain of a child engaging in certain activities that are meant for adults. And again, the implications of a childlike mind, I think it says a lot about the people behind the project, and just in general, it is so depraved. I, again, don't like movies like that to do well, and I'm glad to see that it's really not doing all much of anything, though it's a smaller budgeted film, so who knows whether or not it'll be profitable or not. Not a film I've really been following all that much, because, again, I really just don't care for it. Wonka has now gotten to $465 million worldwide, so this movie is definitely on the cusp of continuing to add to its overall profits. The fact that it got to $125 million in its overall production budget means, again, typical break even is somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times its budget. At 3.7 times its budget, that's a very good sign. I will say, of course, though, because it does have a higher international take, that does obviously make it a lot harder. That means that the actual profits for this movie are not nearly as high as they could be, especially since they do have about $5 million of that coming specifically from China as of the last update. So again, this film is indeed at the point of its breaking even, making profit, but it's not nearly as much profit as it could be if it was making more money domestically or in some other countries. Night Swim at $17 million, again, making some splash overseas. See what I did there, Tony. And so $5.6 million internationally. Still a movie that needs to make a little bit more to actually break even. This is also the kind of movie in this horror film, right, where you have those horror fans that will show up to it opening night, opening weekend, but then they usually fall off. Unless there's something really special, you really don't typically have a lot of repeat viewings or a very strong hold from the week 1 to week 2. I have not really heard a whole lot about this movie, even from people that do follow more of the Blumhouse variety, more of a horror film variety. And so I think ultimately that's a very bad sign if people aren't really talking about it. So who knows whether this film will be able to, cross its break-even point. It did not cost all that much to make, and so it very well still could do that, right? No budget being reported here, but we do have a report of around $15 million of a budget. And so you're looking at the film still needing to make well over 30 plus million worldwide to break even. So again, definitely has a chance of doing so, but definitely not a strong start that I think that they were thinking it to be. The fact that it got number 2 to Wonka being out for 4 weeks, that being a brand new release, I think says quite a lot. Now, Aquaman, as I mentioned, may have just crossed that $100 million number there domestically, but look at the fact that you have over $200 plus million coming from those international markets, and most importantly, the fact that 54 million of that is coming from China. Now, these numbers will continue to update on the site, but ultimately, this is not looking good for this movie, because when you have a higher yield coming from those international markets, and also especially the highest of those international markets being China, that means your return on investment is very, very low. Migration, $150 million worldwide. Again, movie that needs to make a bit more to actually break even, but it's also a film that could make more over time, so we'll have to wait and see. Anyone But You, again, as I mentioned, the poster to me is just trying to scream sex appeal. Apparently, people are interested in that. Boys in the Boat, this is based on true story, directed by George Clooney. So again, a film that is probably doing better than what it probably has any right to, just to the fact that it's a very small story, not something that I think is too well known. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It's something that's kind of off my radar, and so I typically, base things off of that mostly because I try to keep up with movies as much as I can. But $33 million domestic is where that current film currently is, as having a Christmas Day release. Color Purple, as I had mentioned, it was up to had $46 million as of last weekend, because most of it had been made, pretty much Christmas Day and into those initial days of its release. So what that means is that this film has essentially made nothing since last weekend. And I think that when you look at those numbers, you look at its dailies, this is a film that's going to be another one of those massive flops for Warner Brothers. Iron Claw, $24 million. Very happy to see that. Very happy to see also this film well over the historical standard there as they've been tracking it. Production budget, right now it's 1.6 times its production budget. Really hope the film is able to take off and do better. Ferrari, $22 million is also a film I have not heard that many great things about, but a film that's not making any money. And then Poor Things, that I mentioned, it just seems like a very sick and depraved story, and I hope the film doesn't actually make its money back. Now, looking into the preview, going to cover that a little bit. So the preview for the weekend would have said that Wonka was expected to take that number 1 spot with $15 million. The film ended up making 14, so it was definitely within that ballpark range for what Box Office Pro put out there. Night Swim was expected to be around the $12 million range in that way, and so when we look at just the numbers for that film, made around $12 million there, and so it looks like basically these numbers were pretty much spot on there. Migration was expected to edge out Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, and so we did see that kind of flip, though as you can see, the difference between them is not all that much, 10.6 versus 10.2, and when the actuals come out, for all we know, Migration could end up edging it out, as sometimes we do see swings like that happen on that Monday and Tuesday after when we get those weekend actuals in that way. Now let's go ahead and go talk about some box office charting, because we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews. So as I mentioned with Night Swim, currently the film needs to make around $37 million to break even, as it had a budget reportedly of $15 million. So right now it's around $11 million in the red. So even if the film stopped today, it would still not be the biggest loss for them. But definitely a movie I think they were hoping would be a bit bigger. Probably one of those movies that Universal was wanting to make a quick buck off of, right? Of trying to make some extra cash off of. So you still could see that happen with them making potential profits, but it's not looking like it's going to be that great for them. Ferrari right now, $128 million in the red. We can make some projections on, as we do have the second weekend numbers for both that and The Color Purple. So with Ferrari, because it now has a second weekend number of $22 million, I'm projecting it to make somewhere by the end of its run between 32 and 45 million. But that ultimately means because it cost $95 million to make, we're going to see losses of close to 120 to 115 million in losses. And it could also be higher than that, right? These are very much more conservative estimates. And so these would be kind of a best case scenario for it. So the best case being for this movie as a $100 million flop is definitely not what you want to be hearing for a film like that. The Color Purple is in a very similar boat, making about twice as much as what Ferrari has made so far, but even at that $54 million mark, it still is only expected to make around $78 to $110 million by the end of its run, meaning because it costs $100 million, we're looking at the film losing anywhere between around $85 to $100 million. And again, because that is much more on that conservative estimate, we could expect the film to probably still be well over that $100 million mark in its actual losses. Can't say I'm all that surprised for movies like this. As I said, we saw something very similar happen with West Side Story earlier in 2021. We'll go ahead actually and pull that up right now. Right, that film by the end of its run had only made around $73 million. And most of that had, of course, been domestically. That film ended up being a $100 million flop, and that film actually had much better legs in the long run. Compared to its first 2 weeks, it actually was a chart breaker, according to this, right? It actually did better than most other films do historically, but even with that, still wasn't enough to make up for its massive budget, massive overspend, and it looks like we're seeing a very similar trajectory for what we have right now with The Color Purple because of the fact that you do have these numbers not quite updating in real time. It's one of the reasons why I also have this part of the chart here so that way you can see it right for yourselves. So again, but $54 million, though, that means that currently this movie is looking at financial losses around $117 million. So we're seeing very, very similar numbers there, and I think that we will see very similar numbers in the future when it comes to comparing Color Purple to that film. Migration now at $150 million means it's actually on the cusp of breaking even, right? It's around $17 million in the red. And because we are still seeing that be in that top 5 category, I think that we could still see it, week in, week out, be able to slowly chip it away. Still, again, not what Illumination was probably hoping for. This looks like just a very, very generic animated movie. It's not looking like a whole lot of audiences are wanting to go see that. They are instead looking like they are going to see films like Wonka instead. Wonka right now, again, using conservative estimates, is looking at around $92 million in profits. But just to give you an idea of what the profits of Wonka are and where Aquaman is currently sitting, I'm going to pull up the real chart, right? The box office crazy chart that I like to say, right? When you actually take into account things like what the domestic take typically is, international take, and China. So as of the last time I updated this chart, right, Aquaman was sitting around $170 million in the red. Now, of course, we have had some updates now, and so we'll go ahead and actually try and do this in real time so that way y'all can kind of see where we get these numbers from. This is another random crazy chart that I found the other day, basically looking at the fact that Rise of Skywalker lost over $100 million. So if you want to find out more information about that, go check out the Salty Saturday podcast that we did yesterday on the Salty Nerd podcast stream, and you can find information there. So anyway, moving into the domestic numbers there, as you can see, we can update that number. Still around $166 million when you look at that number overall. So let's go ahead now, go into those international numbers. As I'd mentioned, you have $54 million coming specifically from China in that instance. So that number has not changed. I have updated the international number there to reflect that 234. So you're still looking at this movie at around $166 million in the red. So this is the reason why the film is not anywhere close to breaking even, right? A very conservative break-even point for the film would have been around $512 million worldwide. But that number goes up quite a bit when a huge portion of that number is coming from places like China and overseas versus coming a lot from the domestic marketplace. So that's the reason why you see those numbers, and you see the numbers kind of reflect that, and you see it reflect that in that specific fashion. Going to Wonka now for a second, as we can see right there, right, $164 million is actually currently where that domestic box office is sitting. So let me see if I can actually update that now in real time. And as you can see, that actually puts that film over the edge. So this film now is seeing profits, right? $3.4 million in profits. And let's just go ahead and double check again. $301 million is currently where that film is sitting in regards to its numbers there. And because luckily its China number is actually quite smaller in comparison to some of the others, still going to call them out because the fact that they're doing any type of business dealings with China is always going to be something I call out. I've called it out with other films, and I'll continue to call that out with this film as well, even though the film, again, is at best a decent movie. So if we add and change this number to $300 million, again, we also take into account the fact that China does have a different take, and so that's why we subtract that number there. And so you can see right now it's actually close to $22 million in profits. So this is a film right now tracking to make somewhere between $50 and $100 million by the end of its run in some net gain profits, if I had to take a guess. While films like The Color Purple and films like Aquaman 2 are massive flops and failures for Warner Brothers. And as you can see, this is definitely not a good look for them because both of these films technically came out in 2023, and that is going to ultimately partake and be a part of the massive $300+ million of financial losses they saw in 2023. And that's not even accounting for the fact that you had to take half of those budgets, rather half of that profit from Barbie, and give that over to Mattel instead. But hopefully those numbers make sense. And let me know your thoughts about these numbers here. Are you surprised to see Night Swim get the number 2 spot to a film like Wonka? Do you think that Wonka is going to be able to continue to add to its overall profits? I mean, it's not outside of the realm of possibility for that film to get upwards of $500 million by the end of its run as far as its worldwide box office is concerned. And that means that it's going to be probably looking pretty good for the film's financial future as being a box office success. Not a massive hit. Doesn't seem like it's going to be a massive hit at this point. Obviously, we'll continue to track those numbers there, but I would love to hear y'all's thoughts. And also just one update about Anyone But You. Again, very close to breaking even there, and it's a lot of it is because of the fact that it has had some pretty decent holds from week 1 to week 2 and so on and so forth. But let me know your thoughts about that and The Color Purple and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, light up that fire button, obviously smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Hopefully, I've got my January shoutouts video attached to this. If I do not, I apologize. I'm trying my best to get those things done. And as always, God bless. And now for a very special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off with my Patreon Chosen members, Father Luca Illich, shout out to you, Father. Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider. And Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. And to my Subscribe Star peeps, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Mr. Roy and ZK-Man, check out his website, xtheboundaries.co. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want access to a giveaways channel on my Discord and plenty of other extra content as well, random crazy stuff out there, check out the YouTube memberships and other membership platforms in the top link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.